The first thing I learned about royal weddings was that the person walking down the aisle did not always have to be the person everyone was waiting for. Sometimes, all it took to save a kingdom was the wrong Omega in the right suit. My name was Caleb Whitmore, and on the morning I married Prince Adrian Blackwell, nothing I wore belonged to me. Not the silver-threaded jacket fitted too tightly across my shoulders, not the pearl cufflinks engraved with my brother's initials, not even the white ceremonial sash that marked me as the promised consort of the Alpha heir. Every inch of fabric had been chosen for Ethan, my older brother, the beautiful one, the polished one, the Omega who had spent his whole life being prepared to stand beside a prince. I had only been asked to stand still while frantic servants pinned and folded and whispered around me as if I were not a person, but a curtain being adjusted before guests arrived. Outside the doors, the grand cathedral bells rang over the capital, bright and merciless, announcing a wedding that was already ruined. Ethan had vanished before sunrise. His room had been found empty, his window unlatched, his engagement ring sitting on the dresser like a final insult. By 7 o'clock, my father's face had gone the color of old paper. By 8, palace guards had searched every road within 10 miles. By 9, King Roland had made the decision no one dared argue with: the alliance between House Whitmore and the crown would not collapse because one Omega had run from duty. There was another Whitmore son. There was me. I stared at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the pale boy looking back. My light brown hair had been brushed until it shone softly beneath the cathedral lamps, my cheeks looked almost delicate from the powder someone had pressed onto my skin, and my blue eyes seemed too wide, too honest, too frightened for a room full of politics. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tear off Ethan's sash and tell them I was not a replacement part for a broken machine. But my mother stood behind me with trembling hands clasped at her chest, and my father would not meet my eyes, and beyond the cathedral waited hundreds of nobles, cameras from every major network, and a prince whose future had just been publicly humiliated. So I walked. The aisle stretched before me like a frozen river, lined with white roses, gold banners, and faces sharpening with confusion as they realized I was not Ethan. At the altar stood Prince Adrian Blackwell, tall, impossibly composed, his black ceremonial uniform edged in silver, his blonde hair catching the winter light that spilled through the stained glass. He looked like every portrait ever painted of royal Alpha blood, cold, flawless, untouchable. Then his gray eyes found mine, and the last bit of air left my lungs. He knew. Of course he knew. The prince did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not shame me before the kingdom. He simply looked at me as if I were the final mistake in a day already full of them. When I reached him, my gloved fingers shook around the bouquet. His expression did not soften. The priest began speaking about loyalty, unity, and sacred bonds, but all I heard was the quiet thunder of my own heartbeat. Adrian leaned just close enough for only me to hear him. His voice was low, controlled, and colder than the marble beneath my feet. This marriage will remain a formality. I swallowed the ache rising in my throat and forced myself not to look away. In that moment, beneath the cathedral lights, I understood exactly what I had become. Not a bride. Not a consort. Not someone chosen. I was the Omega who had arrived in another man's place, wearing another man's crown, about to marry an Alpha prince who would never forgive me for saying yes. The vows ended with applause that sounded more like a verdict than a celebration. I stood beside Prince Adrian Blackwell while the entire cathedral rose to honor a marriage neither of us had chosen, and every clap echoed against the stone walls like proof that the lie had already become law. His hand rested lightly against mine for the official portrait, warm through the white glove, but there was no comfort in the touch. It was careful, distant, perfectly arranged for the cameras flashing beyond the aisle. To the kingdom, we looked like duty preserved. To the nobles whispering behind their programs, I was the emergency solution in borrowed silk. To Adrian, I was the reminder that his real bride had escaped and left him with someone forgettable. The ride back to Blackwell Palace took 12 minutes through streets packed with citizens waving flags and tossing white petals at the royal motorcade. I knew because I counted every minute to keep myself from shaking. The glass between us and the crowd was tinted, but I could still see children lifted onto shoulders, reporters leaning over barricades, old women pressing their hands to their hearts as if they had witnessed a fairy tale. Adrian sat across from me in silence, one ankle crossed over the other, his profile carved in winter light. He did not look at me once. When the palace gates opened, revealing acres of silver fountains, clipped hedges, and white stone towers, I felt smaller than I had in the cathedral. Blackwell Palace was not a home. It was a monument built to remind people where power lived. Servants bowed as we entered the east wing prepared for the newly married royal couple, but no one smiled for long. Their eyes flickered to my face, then to the sash that still bore Ethan's custom embroidery, and I watched understanding settle over them like frost. Inside the private reception room, King Roland gave a brief, polished speech about sacrifice and stability. My parents stood nearby, pale and stiff, as if affection would make them look guilty. Then the doors closed, the courtiers vanished, and I was alone with the Alpha Prince who was now my husband. Adrian removed his gloves with precise, controlled movements. For a moment, I thought he might finally say something kind, something human, even if it was only that none of this was my fault. Instead, he placed the gloves on a polished table and said, "Your room is through the adjoining hall. The staff has been instructed to treat you with the respect owed to your position." My throat tightened. My position? He looked at me then, and his gray eyes were steady enough to hurt. Royal consort in name. Nothing more. I nodded because pride was the only thing I had left that still belonged to me. I understand. Something almost unreadable crossed his face, so brief I might have imagined it. Good. Public appearances will continue as scheduled. Private expectations will not. The words were not cruel in volume, but they landed with the weight of a door being locked. He was making the boundaries clear, building a wall between us before I could mistake duty for possibility. I wanted to tell him I had not asked for this either. I wanted to tell him I had been pushed into the aisle just as surely as he had been forced to wait at the altar. But the sentence stayed trapped behind my teeth, because I knew he would not care yet. That evening, a maid named Clara led me through the adjoining hall to a suite larger than my entire childhood apartment in the Whitmore Estate's west wing. There were cream walls, a fireplace framed in marble, tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, and a bed neatly turned down beneath a canopy of pale blue silk. On the dresser sat a silver tray with tea, fruit, and a folded card welcoming his royal consort Caleb Blackwell. I stared at the new name until the letters blurred. Blackwell. Not Whitmore. Not Ethan. Me. The mistake had been written into the palace records before sunset. When Clara asked if I needed anything, I almost said my life back, but instead I thanked her softly and waited until she left before sitting on the edge of the bed. The room was silent except for the distant sound of the palace clock striking 8. Somewhere beyond the wall, Adrian existed in the other half of our arranged life, probably relieved that I had not cried in front of him. I looked down at the ring on my finger, a slim band of platinum that felt heavier than any crown, and made myself a promise. If I had to survive as the unwanted consort of an alpha prince, I would not beg to be loved. I would learn the rules of this palace, hold my head high, and give them no easy reason to call me weak. But as the fire burned low and the first night of my marriage stretched cold and endless around me, I pressed my hand over my chest and admitted the truth to the dark. I had never felt more alone in my life. By sunrise, the palace had already given me a name I had never chosen. The replacement Omega. I heard it first in the corridor outside the breakfast room, spoken in a whisper too polished to be accidental. Two young nobles stood near a window overlooking the east garden, pretending to admire the frost on the hedges while their voices floated easily through the open doorway. They said Ethan would have known how to smile for the cameras. They said Prince Adrian deserved someone radiant, not someone who looked as if he had been pulled from a library and dressed in another man's future. I paused with my hand on the doorframe, my stomach tightening, but I did not turn back. If they expected me to flee, they would be disappointed. I entered the room with my shoulders straight and my chin lifted, just as the etiquette tutors had once tried to teach Ethan while I sat forgotten in the corner with a book in my lap. The breakfast table stretched nearly 20 feet, set with silver dishes, crystal glasses, and white porcelain trimmed in gold. Adrian was already seated at the far end, reading a stack of reports beside his coffee. He looked up only long enough to acknowledge me with a slight nod, then returned to his papers. No one else at the table seemed surprised. In this palace, coldness had a schedule. I sat across from him, far enough away that we could have been strangers sharing a hotel lobby. A servant poured tea into my cup, and I thanked her by name after glancing at the small badge pinned to her uniform. Her eyes widened, then softened for half a second before she remembered where she was. "You do not need to memorize the staff," Adrian said without looking up. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. I was not memorizing her. I was acknowledging her. The pages in his hand stilled. For the first time that morning, his attention sharpened on me. That is unusual for someone raised in House Whitmore. Maybe House Whitmore did not raise me as carefully as everyone thinks. He studied me for a breath, as if he had expected resentment and found something less convenient. Then the door opened, and Lady Marissa Vale swept in with a smile bright enough to cut glass. She was graceful, blonde, beautifully dressed. In pale green, and every inch the kind of omega the court understood how to admire. She kissed the air near Adrian's cheek, offered me a curtsy so shallow it was almost a joke, and said, "Your Highness, I hope the new consort is settling in." Sudden changes can be so confusing for those unprepared for palace life. The words were soft. The insult was not. I felt every servant in the room go still. Adrian said nothing. Perhaps he thought silence was neutrality. Perhaps, to a prince, it was. I placed my teacup down carefully. "You are kind to worry, Lady Marissa." Fortunately, confusion fades faster than bad manners. Her smile froze. Across the table, Adrian lowered his reports by an inch. I did not look at him. I did not need approval for the first honest sentence I had spoken since the wedding. The rest of the morning passed through a series of introductions designed to remind me how little I knew. There were ministers, protocol officers, household managers, and advisors who explained traditions as though I were a child. I listened. I asked questions. I remembered details. By noon, I had learned that the palace kitchens were short on staff because several workers had fallen ill after a winter supply delay. By 2, I had noticed that the seating chart for next week's charity luncheon placed 2 rival senators beside each other, a mistake that would turn a public event into a silent disaster. By 4, I had sent a quiet note to Clara asking whether the kitchen staff had received medical support or merely instructions to keep working. I did not expect anyone important to care. But just before dinner, while I stood alone in the blue drawing room, Adrian entered holding the corrected seating chart in one hand and my note about the kitchen in the other. "You changed the luncheon arrangement," he said. I turned from the window. "I suggested a change. You also requested a physician for the kitchen workers. They feed half the palace." It seemed practical. His gray eyes moved over my face, searching for ambition, performance, some hidden Whitmore strategy. I let him search. There was nothing to find. "At last," he said, quieter than before, "most people in your position would have spent today trying to secure influence. Most people in my position were supposed to be my brother." The words slipped out before I could soften them. The room went still between us. For a moment, something like regret touched Adrian's expression, but it disappeared too quickly to trust. He placed the papers on the table. "The physician has been sent. The seating chart has been approved." It was not an apology. It was barely praise. But in the Palace of Whispers, it was the first proof that I could be more than the mistake they had named me. After he left, I looked out at the darkening garden, where snow had begun to fall in delicate, silent threads. For the first time since the cathedral doors had opened, I felt something other than fear. Not hope. Not yet. But a small, steady ember of resolve. They could call me the replacement Omega if they wanted. I would let them whisper. Then I would give them a reason to remember my real name. The first week of my marriage taught me that proximity could be more painful than distance. Adrian and I were not strangers allowed to avoid each other anymore. We were a royal couple now, at least in the eyes of the kingdom, and the palace schedule treated our private discomfort as irrelevant. On Monday, we stood side by side at a children's hospital opening, smiling for cameras while I helped a little girl choose a blue ribbon for the dedication ceremony. On Tuesday, we attended a military scholarship luncheon where every general seemed to measure me against the absent perfection of Ethan. On Wednesday, we toured the Winter Relief Center on the north side of the capital, where families lined up for coats, canned food, and heating vouchers as snow piled against the sidewalks in soft white banks. That was the day Adrian stopped looking at me like an inconvenience and started looking at me as if I were a question he had not expected to ask. The relief center had been staged for royal photographs, but poverty did not know how to perform politely. A mother with red hands tried to quiet a crying toddler while balancing 2 grocery bags against her hip. An elderly man apologized 3 times for needing help filling out a form. Because his glasses had broken. Volunteers smiled too hard under fluorescent lights while pretending they were not overwhelmed. I moved before any advisor could tell me where to stand. I knelt beside the elderly man, read the form aloud, and filled in the sections he could not see. I gave my gloves to the mother and tied the toddler's scarf so it covered his ears. A staff member whispered that the cameras were waiting near the donation wall, but I barely heard her. For the first time since the wedding, I was not thinking about how to survive the palace. I was thinking about how cold that child's fingers felt in mine. When I finally looked up, Adrian was watching me from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but the sharp winter edge of his alpha presence had softened in a way I felt before I understood it. Not warmth, exactly. More like a frozen window beginning to thaw at the corners. On the ride back, he did not open his reports. He looked out at the gray city for several minutes before saying, "You were not trained for public charity work." I kept my eyes on my hands. No. I was trained to stay out of the way. And yet you do not. I turned toward him, surprised by the quietness of his voice. Should I have? He looked at me then, and for once there was no immediate wall in his gaze. No, that single word followed me for the rest of the day. By evening, the palace had settled under a storm. Wind pressed snow against the tall windows, and the corridors smelled faintly of cedar polish, candle smoke, and the white roses arranged in every public room. I could not sleep, so I went to the Royal Library, a vast circular chamber with shelves rising 3 stories high and a painted ceiling full of constellations. I had planned to read for an hour. Instead, I found files on the northern districts, heating shortages, school closures, and old budget proposals marked delayed. One document led to another. One question became 10. The fire burned low. My tea went cold. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally pulled me under, and I fell asleep at the long oak table with my cheek against a page of handwritten notes. I woke to warmth settling over my shoulders. For one suspended second, I thought I was dreaming. Then I opened my eyes and saw a dark wool coat draped around me, heavy and carrying the clean, quiet scent of frost, cedar, and something unmistakably Adrian. He stood beside the table in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, his hair less perfect than usual, his expression caught somewhere between irritation and concern. "You will get sick sleeping here," he said. I sat up too quickly, embarrassed, gathering my notes as if they were evidence of a crime. "I am sorry. I did not mean to intrude. It is a library, Caleb. You are allowed to read." Hearing my name in his voice changed the room more than it should have. Until then, he had called me by titles, by formal distance, by nothing at all. Caleb sounded almost dangerous because it sounded real. He glanced at the open files, then at the columns of figures I had copied into my notebook. "You found the district reports. They were not hidden. Most people would not look. I traced the edge of the page with my thumb. Most people are not trying to prove they deserve the roof over their head. The words left me softly, but they struck harder than I intended. Adrian's face changed. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But the stillness around him shifted, and the room felt suddenly smaller. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked. "A roof you have to earn?" I gave a small, humorless smile. "Your Highness, everything about my life here has been something I had to earn after receiving it by mistake." For a long moment, he said nothing. Snow tapped gently at the windows. The fire cracked in the silence. Then Adrian reached for one of the reports and sat across from me instead of leaving. "Show me what you found," he said. It was not affection. It was not forgiveness. But as I turned the notebook toward him and our shoulders leaned over the same pool of lamplight, I felt the first real crack in the ice between us. The royal ball arrived with the kind of beauty that made every dangerous thing look harmless. Crystal chandeliers burned above the grand hall like captured stars, casting gold light over marble floors, white roses, silver ribbons, and hundreds of nobles dressed in velvet and silk. Outside, snow covered the palace gardens in a clean, silent blanket, but inside, the air was warm with perfume, polished smiles, and the quiet pressure of people waiting for me to fail. I stood at Adrian's side at the top of the staircase, my hand resting lightly on his arm as the herald announced us to the room. For once, his posture did not feel like a wall beside me. Over the past few days, something between us had changed in small ways no one else would notice. He sent the Northern District proposal back to the council with my notes attached. He began asking for my opinion during breakfast instead of speaking around me. When a reporter asked whether I was adjusting to palace life, Adrian answered before I could, saying, "His royal consort has already served this palace with more attention than many who were born inside it." It was not a confession. It was not tenderness. But it was the first time he defended my place without being forced to. I carried that sentence into the ball like a hidden flame. Then I saw Ethan. My brother stood near the center of the hall in a midnight blue suit, his dark blonde hair styled perfectly, his smile soft enough to look innocent from a distance. For one impossible second, the room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Ethan was supposed to be missing, searched for, whispered about like a scandal without a body. Instead, he was here, calm and beautiful, surrounded by courtiers who stepped aside for him as if the original story had returned to correct the mistake. Lady Marissa stood beside him, her gloved hand resting on his sleeve, her eyes bright with satisfaction. Adrian felt me go still. "Caleb," he asked quietly. I tried to answer, but my throat had closed. Ethan crossed the room with graceful steps, stopping just far enough away to make the moment public. "Your Highness," he said, bowing to Adrian before turning his gaze to me. "Brother. I hope you have enjoyed what was meant for me." The whispers began instantly, soft as falling ash and twice as suffocating. I felt them touching every part of me, replacement, imposter, desperate, ambitious. My fingers tightened around Adrian's sleeve before I could stop myself. Lady Marissa's smile curved. How emotional this must be. The palace has been so generous to accept such a sudden substitution. Adrian's expression cooled, but before he could speak, Ethan lowered his voice just enough that the nearest nobles could still hear. "Tell me, Caleb, did you hesitate at all before taking my place?" The question struck exactly where he intended. The chandeliers blurred. The scent of hundreds of Alpha and Omega guests pressed in around me, layered with roses, champagne, winter air, and judgment. My suppressants had always been reliable, my cycles carefully monitored by physicians because the Whitmore family valued control above comfort. But stress could unravel even the most disciplined body. At first, it was only warmth beneath my collar. Then a tremor in my hands. Then the sudden, terrifying bloom of my own scent rising into the air, soft and unmistakable, like white lavender after rain. I froze. Conversations faltered one by one until silence spread across the ballroom. I heard a glass touch a tray too loudly. Someone gasped. Shame rushed through me so fast my knees nearly weakened, not because I had done anything wrong, but because my body had chosen the worst possible moment to become visible. "I need to leave," I whispered. But before I could step back, Adrian moved. He turned toward me with a sharpness I had never seen, not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition so powerful it stripped the cold from his face. His gray eyes darkened, and the controlled frost of his alpha presence broke open into something fierce and protective. The air changed. Every noble in the hall felt it. Adrian stepped in front of me, shielding me from the room with his body and his title, and the scent that rose from him met mine like a key finding a lock no one knew existed. Frost and cedar. Lavender and rain. The reaction was immediate, ancient, undeniable. The murmurs died completely. Adrian looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time and remembering me from every lifetime before this one. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. "Adrian," I said, frightened by the silence. He did not look away. His voice, when it came, was low enough for me alone and shaken in a way I had never heard from him. "Caleb," he whispered, "what are you?" The question left Adrian's lips so quietly that no one beyond the circle of our shared silence could have heard it, but I felt it move through me like a bell struck deep beneath the earth. "What are you?" I did not know how to answer, because until that moment, I had only ever been what other people needed me to be. A spare son. A quiet brother. A substitute consort. A mistake dressed in silver. But Adrian was looking at me as if every one of those names had fallen away, and something older, truer, and far more frightening had appeared in their place. The ballroom remained frozen around us. Nobles stood with hands half raised, whispers trapped behind painted smiles. Ethan's face had gone pale in a way I had never seen before, the soft confidence draining from his expression as he realized the room was no longer looking at him. Lady Marissa's hand tightened around her fan until the delicate ivory ribs bent under her grip. Adrian did not notice them. His attention stayed on me, sharp and unguarded, while the scent between us filled the polished air with impossible certainty. Frost and cedar. White lavender after rain. Two separate notes becoming one chord. Then King Roland's voice cut through the silence from the upper dais. "Clear the hall." The command was calm, but no one mistook it for a request. Within seconds, royal guards and senior stewards began guiding guests toward the side exits with practiced efficiency. The orchestra stopped. Cameras were lowered. Reporters protested until the palace press secretary stepped in front of them with a smile that promised consequences without raising her voice. Adrian remained between me and the crowd until the last of the staring faces disappeared behind the gold doors. Only then did my knees weaken. He turned instantly, one hand hovering near my arm without touching, as if he had finally learned that protection did not mean possession. "Caleb, can you walk?" I nodded, though the floor seemed too bright, too wide, too unreal. "I just need air." He looked toward the nearest attendant. "Bring Dr. Graves to the East Conservatory. Now." We moved through a private corridor lined with portraits of Blackwell monarchs, their painted eyes following us as if even the dead wanted to witness the scandal. Adrian walked beside me, close enough that I could feel the steadiness of him, not close enough to trap me. That careful distance hurt more than I expected because it proved he was trying. In the conservatory, night pressed against the glass walls, and snow drifted beyond the panes in soft, silent waves. Orange trees and winter lilies filled the room with green life, but all I could focus on was my own breathing. Dr. Helen Graves arrived 5 minutes later with a medical bag, silver hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck, her expression composed but alert. She asked for permission before checking my pulse, then Adrian's, then the scent response registered by the palace monitors hidden in the ballroom ventilation system. It was humiliating in its clinical quietness, but Dr. Graves spoke gently, explaining each step as if I were still allowed to have control over my own body. King Roland stood near the doors with 2 advisors. Ethan and Lady Marissa had somehow been permitted inside as family witnesses, though neither came close. Dr. Graves read the results twice. The second time, her eyes lifted to Adrian with the kind of certainty that could change laws. "There is no evidence of artificial scent interference," she said. "No stimulant pattern, no chemical distortion, no irregular suppressant failure beyond stress response." Lady Marissa's voice sharpened. "Doctor, surely a public reaction does not prove anything sacred." Dr. Graves did not even look at her. "No, Lady Marissa. But a synchronized alpha and omega bond response of this strength, confirmed through scent, pulse, and neurological patterning, is extraordinarily rare." My fingers curled around the edge of the chair. Adrian's face had become very still. "Say it plainly," King Roland ordered. Dr. Graves closed the file. "His royal consort Caleb Blackwell is Prince Adrian's true mate." The words entered the conservatory and rewrote every life inside it. Ethan stepped back as if the floor had shifted. Lady Marissa's smile disappeared completely. King Roland exhaled through his nose, not surprised exactly, but calculating how fast the kingdom would turn this revelation into history. I could not move. True mate. The phrase should have sounded beautiful, like something from old poems and moonlit legends. Instead, it terrified me. Because it meant my body had known something my heart had never been allowed to choose. Adrian crossed the room slowly, stopping several feet away. His eyes held wonder, guilt, and something raw enough to make me look down. Then he turned toward his father, Ethan, Marissa, the advisors, and the palace staff gathered in the doorway. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of the crown he would one day inherit. "He is not the mistake." The room went utterly silent. Adrian looked back at me, and this time, everyone saw it. "He is my mate." My breath caught, but the ache in my chest did not vanish. A public declaration could change the palace. It could silence whispers. It could put Ethan and Marissa in their places. But it could not erase the memory of a cathedral where I had stood unwanted, or a wedding night where I had been told my marriage was only a formality. Adrian's words had finally given me a place beside him. The painful truth was that I no longer knew whether a place was the same thing as a home. By morning, the whole palace knew, and by noon, so did the kingdom. The official announcement was short, careful, and wrapped in the kind of polished language that made a storm sound like weather. His royal consort Caleb Blackwell had experienced a confirmed mate bond response with Crown Prince Adrian Blackwell during the Winter Alliance Ball. The royal physician had verified the bond as natural, rare, and legally recognized under the crown's oldest traditions. News anchors repeated my name until it stopped sounding like mine. Commentators who had called me a substitute 3 days earlier now spoke of destiny, sacred bonds, and the mysterious wisdom of fate. The same nobles who had whispered behind fans sent flowers to my suite. White lilies, winter roses, silver orchids, each arrangement more apologetic than the last, each card pretending kindness had always been there. I stood among them in my robe, staring at the room full of fragrant lies, and felt nothing close to joy. Adrian came to see me just after breakfast. He did not enter without permission. He knocked, waited, and stepped inside only when Clara opened the door and I said yes. That alone told me something had changed, but change was not the same as repair. He wore a dark suit instead of ceremonial uniform, no medals, no royal sash, nothing that could turn apology into performance. For a moment, he only looked at the flowers crowding every table and windowsill. "I can have them removed," he said. "They bother you." I turned from the window. Everyone suddenly knows how to be sorry when history changes its mind. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. Caleb. My name sounded different now. Softer. Careful. As if he understood it was something he had mishandled. "I owe you more than flowers. More than a public statement." I folded my hands in front of me so he would not see them tremble. Do you? He took the question seriously, and that hurt in a new way. Yes. I treated you as a consequence of Ethan's betrayal instead of a person forced into the same disaster I was. I let the court define you before I knew you. I used distance because I thought it was restraint, but it became cruelty. No one had ever described my pain so accurately while standing inside it. I wanted the words to heal me. I wanted to step into the warmth they offered and believe that destiny had finally made everything simple. But the memory of the cathedral remained too bright. The memory of the first night, the closed door, the sentence that reduced our marriage to a formality. I looked at him and saw both men at once, the prince who had wounded me and the alpha who had shielded me in front of an entire ballroom. You found your mate last night, I said quietly. But I lost my dignity before that. Adrian went still. The words did not strike him loudly. They sank in, which was worse. I know, he said. I am sorry. I shook my head. I do not need you to be sorry because the bond made you feel guilty. I do not need the palace to decide I matter because my scent matches yours. I needed to matter when everyone thought I was no one. Snow moved beyond the windows in slow, pale sheets. Adrian looked down, and for the first time, I saw the Crown Prince of Blackwell with nothing to command. No room to control. No law to invoke. Just a man facing the damage left by his own silence. Tell me what you need, he said. And I will do it. The simple offer almost broke me. Not because it solved everything, but because no one in my life had ever asked that without already knowing the answer they wanted. I drew a breath that shook on the way in. Space, I said. Time. A room that is mine because I choose it, not because you placed me there. And I want the Northern District proposal moved forward without my name attached like a publicity ribbon. Those families needed help before I became convenient. Adrian nodded once. Done. And I will not share your room because of a bond. His eyes lifted to mine, wounded but steady. I would never ask that of you. The certainty in his voice loosened something painful in my chest. He understood. Or he was beginning to. Over the next week, he proved it without speeches. My flowers disappeared. The Northern Relief funding passed through Council under an emergency winter measure, not a romantic headline. At breakfast, he asked whether I preferred coffee or tea and remembered the answer the next morning. When courtiers praised our bond too loudly, he corrected them, saying my work had nothing to do with biology. He did not touch me in public for the cameras. He did not corner me in private with promises. He simply became present, steady, and patient in ways that made the palace feel less like a cage and more like a place with doors. One night, I found a small envelope outside my suite. Inside was the original wedding program from the cathedral, the one printed with Ethan's name beside Adrian's. Across it, in Adrian's handwriting, were 4 words, "This was my failure." Beneath it lay a new blank program, my name written carefully beside his, not printed by command, not announced by law, but placed there by his own hand. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long time, holding both versions of my life. For the first time, I did not know which one hurt more, the one where he had not wanted me, or the one where he was finally learning how. The accusation arrived on a Monday morning, folded inside a cream envelope sealed with the crest of the Royal Ethics Council. I was in the library reviewing school closure reports when Clara entered with a face so pale that I stood before she spoke. The letter did not shout. Palace documents never did. They destroyed lives in perfect grammar. A formal inquiry had been opened into the legitimacy of my confirmed mate bond with Prince Adrian Blackwell. Anonymous testimony claimed I had used an illegal scent enhancer during the Winter Alliance ball to manipulate a royal alpha response. Until the investigation concluded, my public duties would be suspended, my medical records reviewed, and my position as royal consort placed under advisory observation. I read the words twice, then a third time, waiting for fear to come first. It did not. Exhaustion came first. Then anger, clean and cold. I had survived being unwanted, then studied like a miracle, and now the same court that had called me destiny wanted to call me fraud. Adrian found me 10 minutes later, already holding his own copy, his gray eyes sharpened into something dangerous but controlled. "This is Ethan and Marissa," he said. "It has to be." I looked at the council seal pressed into the paper. Then they planned it well enough to make the palace listen. The hearing was scheduled for the next afternoon in the Crown Chamber, a circular room beneath a glass dome where generations of Blackwell monarchs had signed laws, ended disputes, and turned private pain into public record. By noon, every news network in the capital was discussing chemical scent fraud, noble jealousy, and whether an untrained consort from House Whitmore could have understood enough biology to deceive the crown. I spent the night not crying, not hiding, and not waiting to be rescued. Instead, I returned to the files. The wedding contracts. The ball security logs. The medical supply registry. The guest access list. If Ethan and Marissa wanted to turn me into a scandal, I would meet them with paper, dates, names, and the one weapon no one expected from the quiet replacement Omega, preparation. At the hearing, Lady Marissa wore soft ivory, the color of innocence. Ethan sat beside her in navy, looking wounded enough to make strangers pity him. "I never wanted to accuse my brother," he told the council, voice gentle, eyes lowered. "But Caleb was always overlooked. I fear desperation made him reckless. The words should have cut me. A week earlier, they would have. Now they sounded rehearsed." Dr. Graves testified first, explaining again that the ballroom readings showed no chemical distortion. Marissa countered with a private laboratory report claiming traces of scent enhancers had been found on a handkerchief from my suite. The chamber stirred. Cameras clicked behind the press barrier. Adrian stood immediately. That evidence was not collected through palace chain of custody. The council chair raised a hand. "Your Highness, you will have your turn." I touched Adrian's sleeve lightly. He looked down at me, and the anger in his face softened into trust. Not command. Not rescue. Trust. I rose. My voice felt calm when I expected it to shake. "May I ask where the handkerchief was found?" Marissa smiled. "In your private sitting room." "Interesting," I said. "Because my private sitting room has been locked since the morning after the ball while the East Suite carpets were replaced due to water damage. Only 4 people had access, myself, Clara, palace maintenance, and temporary floral staff assigned by Lady Marissa's office." Her smile thinned. I placed the access logs on the table. The floral staff entered twice. Once without Clara present. The badge used belonged to a woman named Elise Porter, who resigned the same evening and left with a palace vehicle signed out by Ethan Whitmore's personal attendant. Ethan's face changed by a fraction, but I saw it. So did Adrian. I continued before anyone could interrupt. I also reviewed the laboratory report. The testing facility is owned by Vale Biomedical Holdings, a company chaired by Lady Marissa's uncle. That does not prove guilt. But it proves conflict of interest. The council chamber went very quiet. Marissa stood. "This is absurd. He is twisting coincidence into theater." I turned to her fully. "No, Lady Marissa. Theater was arriving beside my brother at the ball and pretending shock when my body reacted under public pressure. Then I looked at Ethan. And theater was running from your wedding, only to return when the wrong Omega became valuable." Ethan's practiced sadness cracked. "You stole my life." For the first time, I felt no need to shrink from him. "No. You abandoned it, and everyone handed me the blame because I was close enough to carry." The words settled over the chamber like falling snow. Adrian rose then, not in front of me, but beside me. "The Crown recognizes Caleb Blackwell as my lawful consort, not because of a bond, not because of scandal, and not because anyone in this room approves of him. Because he has shown more integrity under humiliation than this court has shown under comfort." King Roland, who had listened in silence from the highest seat, finally spoke. The inquiry is dismissed. A separate investigation into evidence tampering will begin immediately. Marissa went pale. Ethan looked at me as if I had become someone he no longer knew how to control. Maybe I had. When the chamber doors opened and daylight spilled across the marble floor, Adrian offered me his arm but did not assume I would take it. I looked at his hand, then at the reporters waiting beyond the doors, then at the man who had finally learned to stand with me instead of over me. This time, when I placed my hand on his arm, it was not because the palace required it. It was because I chose to. The second ceremony took place 3 weeks after the inquiry, not in the grand cathedral where my life had been rearranged beneath 1,000 watching eyes, but in the winter garden behind Blackwell Palace, where the snow had melted from the glass roof and the first white blossoms had begun to open along the orange trees. Adrian had asked, not commanded. He came to my suite one quiet evening with the old platinum ring in his palm and no audience to witness him. I do not want our only vows to be the ones you were forced to say, he told me. I want to ask you properly, and I want you to have the right to refuse. For a long time, I only looked at him. The bond between us was still there, steady and warm beneath every silence, but it no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a door neither of us had to walk through unless we chose it. Then ask, I said. Adrian lowered himself to one knee on the carpet, not as a prince performing humility, but as a man placing his pride where it could no longer stand between us. Caleb Whitmore Blackwell, he said, voice quiet but certain, will you let me become your husband in truth, not because of a treaty, not because of biology, not because the kingdom expects it, but because I will spend the rest of my life choosing you with patience, respect, and love. I thought of the cathedral, the borrowed sash, the cold ride through cheering streets, the empty suite where I had promised not to beg to be loved. I thought of the library lamp, the Northern District files, the hearing chamber, and Adrian standing beside me while the court finally learned my name. Then I held out my hand. Yes, I said. But this time, I choose myself too. So the second wedding was small. King Roland attended without a crown. Clara stood near the front with tears shining in her eyes. Dr. Graves smiled from beneath a pale blue hat. The children from the Northern Relief Center sent paper snowflakes with our names written in crayon, and Adrian insisted they be hung among the flowers. Ethan did not attend. He had left the capital after confessing he had run from the first wedding because he loved the idea of being chosen more than the reality of duty. Lady Marissa's family withdrew from court while the investigation continued, and for once, their absence felt less like punishment and more like clean air. I wore a suit made for me, cream wool with silver embroidery at the cuffs, no borrowed initials, no hidden apology sewn into the lining. Adrian waited beneath the orange trees in a charcoal suit, his expression soft in a way the whole world would have once called impossible. When I reached him, he did not take my hand until I offered it. That small pause was the reason I knew we would be all right. Our vows were not grand. Mine began with honesty. I told him I had been afraid of becoming a symbol instead of a person. I told him love could not grow where dignity was missing. Then I promised to walk beside him as long as he remembered that beside did not mean behind. Adrian's vow was even simpler. He promised to listen before protecting, to ask before assuming, to defend my work without turning it into a story about himself, and to love me on ordinary mornings when no prophecy, scandal, or ancient bond was watching. When he slid the ring onto my finger again, it felt lighter than it had the first time. Not because the metal had changed, but because I had. After the ceremony, there was no ballroom full of gossip, no forced reception, no photographers shouting for the perfect angle. There was only dinner under lanterns, warm bread, roasted chicken, apple cider, and laughter that did not sound rehearsed. Later, as twilight settled purple over the garden, Adrian and I walked alone along the glass wall where snow still clung to the edges outside. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. I knew what he meant. The mistake. The bond. The life neither of us had planned. I looked at our reflections in the glass. the Alpha Prince who had learned that power meant nothing without tenderness, and the Omega who had entered the palace as someone else's replacement and stayed as himself. "No," I said at last. "But I am grateful it stopped being a mistake." Adrian smiled, and for the first time, there was no sorrow behind it. Years later, people would tell the story as if fate had been kind from the beginning, as if destiny had simply placed me where I belonged. They would forget the loneliness, the humiliation, the hard work of becoming real to each other after the bond appeared. But I would remember. I would remember because that was the part that mattered. Fate may have opened the door, but love was what we built after walking through it. And every morning after, when the palace bells rang over the capital and Adrian reached for my hand before facing the kingdom, I no longer felt like the Omega wearing another man's crown. I was Caleb Blackwell, royal consort, true mate, and the first person in my own life who had finally chosen me,